Some of the views expressed on the Mormon Channel are solely for the education and inspiration of our audience and may not represent the official position of the Church.
One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. A new exhibit at the Church Museum of Art is called Pieces of Me, Quilted Expressions of Human Ties. This beautiful exhibit captures not just the art of quilting, but also many of the reasons, emotions, and events that bring quilting art to life in the lives of Latter-day Saints past and present. And joining me today are exhibit co-curators, Jennifer Hadley and Jeannie Fetzer, along with museum educator Angela Ames, who are instrumental in bringing this exhibit to life. Now, I'd like to know a little bit more about each of you, so let's start with Jennifer. Tell me about what brought you to the museum, what things you're working on right now. Anyway, let's just go for it.
Well, I have a master's in historic textiles, and so when I was looking for something to do with that, somebody suggested I check out the Church History Museum, and so I did, and they were nice enough to hire me on, and I've been there ever since. And when the idea for a quilting exhibit came up, they asked me if I would be on that team, since my emphasis is in textiles, and so I agreed to do that. So that's how I got to be there.
Excellent. Jeannie, you're a freelancer, so to speak. What brought you to this exhibit?
I started working with the museum as a church service missionary in the conservation lab with Blanche Miles, who's one of the finest seamstresses I've ever known. And she trained me, and it also piqued an interest, furthered my interest in quilt history, and began a journey for me to train as a quilt historian, and which really was something you do on your own. And then I ended up finishing a degree at the University of Utah at the age of 52 in women's history, and found very generous professors who let me do many independent projects in quilt history. And my final senior project was on quilts at the Church Museum. So I began a good association with the museum as a church service missionary.
Excellent. Thank you.
That's how we knew she'd be a good co-curator for this show.
Wonderful. Angela, what does the museum educator do?
A museum educator really takes all of the content that our subject matter specialists provide, and we make it something that is a little more accessible to our audiences. So we give it a narrative format and kind of craft the information into a story. And then we also create fun and interactive ways of teaching about the subject matter so that people who are in our galleries can enjoy the learning along the way.
So the little hands-off exhibit as you walk through the door perhaps is just a way to teach people. I'm talking about the little piece of white cloth, and of course you know what I'm talking about, where you're invited to touch it to show exactly what can happen when you touch a piece of cloth a lot. Anyway, sure. I'm sure that's part of it.
Well, and also we have a sewing wall. We call it our sewing wall, and a piecing wall in the exhibit. So one is a giant magnet board where the kids can take little pieces that are cut like pieces of fabric that you put together to create a quilt block, and they can create their own quilt designs and quilt blocks. And then we have a big wall with a quilt block printed on it where the children can sew a thread in and out of the holes in the wall.
She says children, but I have seen more adults and teenagers playing on that wall. Well, maybe not more, but just as many as the kids. So it's kind of fun for everybody.
Before we really get into the quilting exhibit, let's talk about some of the other things that are coming up that you're working on that are in the future. Angela?
Sure. We have upcoming a very unique opportunity to host an international art competition for youth. And we have always, every 3 years, had an international art competitions for our professional artists in the church, but have not ever hosted one for the youth of the church. So that will be an exhibit opening in 2012, and we're really excited because we'll have an opportunity to bring in a committee of youth to help jury and curate that show.
Wow.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
I'm working on that team with Angela, too, and I guess we should say that preceding that exhibit will immediately follow the adult competition that we have, and they're still taking submissions for that. The submissions close in October, and you can find out information on both competitions on our website. So,
excellent. All right. So the Deseret News reported that the opening of this event, this exhibit, had more church leadership on hand than any time since the museum's opening. Why all the attention?
Well, Elder Johnson thought it would be a nice opportunity and a good time to invite the brethren back to the museum, since it had been a while since we had invited all of them at once. And we had an art exhibit opening at the same time as the quilt exhibit. And so we've been trying to revitalize and to employ more interactive elements in our exhibits, and to do some more new things. And so they thought it would be a good time to invite the brethren to come and see the direction that we were going, and to partake in the new interactives and whatnot.
I think quilting, since we're such a pioneer-oriented organization, this church has been a big part of what we do here. Tell me how this exhibit came about.
Well, it was a suggestion we got from a patron who plays a part in the quilt market that was coming to Salt Lake. And so she suggested that a quilt exhibit would be a wonderful thing in the museum, and a wonderful way that those who were interested could come and get some exposure to the church and to learn a little bit more about us. So that was the first suggestion, and we took that to heart, and we formed a team, and then we thought about what the message should be for the show, and kind of evolved and progressed from there into what it became today.
Thank you. Let's talk about the history of quilting to begin with in the church, and
why don't you take this, Jeannie?
Who's best to take that one?
Well, I have found through the years that there is not a particular LDS style of quilting per se, unlike the Amish, where you are dictated by color and style that the Amish people follow. Mormon women quilters, draw from the outside quilting community, with the exception perhaps of genealogy quilts, though they are not the only people who do genealogy quilts, listing their family members. They may have Mormon themes in their quilts, but they are very much part of the outside community of quilters. And I think that's exciting that there is not a particular Mormon theme in quilting, because it's a way for them to join in community efforts and community humanitarian efforts of quilting. And the craft itself was carried across the continent simply for the need of warmth. And the American style of quilting was unique in the sense that, unlike quilts from across the Atlantic, piece blocks developed in the United States. And up until that time, they had been what were called whole cloth quilting, where a large piece of cloth was taken and 3 layers, the bottom and the top, with a piece of batting in between, were then stitched together to form a quilt. And until about 1825, that was the style of quilting, was whole cloth quilting. And then Americans began what is called a pieced block. And that's when you begin to see patterns and separate blocks in quilting. And that became the unique style of American quilting, which LDS quilters incorporated in their own pieces.
This might be a good time to say that quilting is not limited to just females.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. In fact, some of my favorite classes that I've taught have included men. And I just met a grandfather. His wife has passed away, and he is completing 13 more quilts to make sure that all 21 of his grandchildren have quilts from their grandparents.
Some of our favorite pieces in the show were either made by men and women together, or some of the pieces were, for example, we have one gentleman who, when he retired, thought, well, I need to make at least one quilt, and now he's made, what is it, over 100 or something? Yeah, so there's a lot of men involved.
And there are so many reasons to make a quilt. My father, in an attempt to connect better with his grandchildren, started making quilts after my mother had passed away. So
Yeah, that's
Yes,
great.
it's very much can be a family effort, and my favorite, one of the reasons I love quilt history so much are the stories, and that's what's behind this exhibit, or the stories behind the quilts, which is why when we began to talk about what should be in the exhibit, my passion is the reason for making a quilt, and is not necessarily the beautiful masterpiece quilts that are put out on a beautiful bed, but it allows every person who chooses to be involved, and you don't have to feel that you're a fine artist to participate in this medium.
So there are some elements of this exhibit, including a kiosk to help educate people as they come through. And the one that I watched all the way through was Elder Jensen talking about the quilt that was presented to him. Angela, can you tell us about that a little bit?
About Elder Jensen's
Sure,
story in particular?
sure.
You know, that was an interesting circumstance and coincidence for us, because we had just given a presentation to Elder Jensen about the exhibit and finished by saying, everyone has a quilt story. Everyone has a story to share. And he said, you know, I have a quilt story. And so he became our first invitation that we extended to have someone submit their own story to kind of complete this broader picture that we were portraying of the stories behind the quilts of our lives. And his quilt happened to be one that was given to him when he was a very young bishop, to express the love of the ward members for him. And every single quilt tells a story about his relationship with a different family in his ward, and the connections that they have to one another and have maintained over time. And it's a very powerful expression of community ties and human bonds.
Thank you. Toward the one end of the exhibit, there are some really old pioneer pieces, some samplers and some quilt pieces that I've noticed. Why were the samplers included?
Well,
first off, maybe we should discuss what a sampler is.
Okay, sure. We wanted to broaden the concept, since this exhibit really was about stories and about human relationships. We wanted to broaden that. Quilts are one way that you can show those stories and those relationships, but other artifacts and items can show that relationship as well. So a sampler is an embroidery that a young pioneer girl would make, and it was part of her education. She would learn her letters and her numbers, as well as the embroidery stitches that she would need to run a household. And that may sound kind of funny that you would need to know embroidery to run a household, but it was a part of running a home. You would embroider initials and number your sets of sheets and things like that, so that they could be rotated properly, because fabric was very expensive and you had to maintain as much as possible. So the reason that the samplers were included was because of that educational element. We have 2 blocks from a quilt top that were made by a young girl that she pieced the quilt top together, and that was part of her education. And they're just incredible. I don't think I could have pieced that well now, and she was 6, and so she did an incredible job. But we paired that with the samplers, which were one of the samplers was another young girl's first, and we have next to that her grandmother's sampler, and you can see some of the stitches that are similar in it, and it shows that her grandmother was teaching her how to embroider, and so that's why they're paired together in that manner.
The quilt pieces are small diamonds. I'm trying to describe what I saw over there, and each edge of the diamond has about 35. I counted 35 stitches, and so this little girl was very busy for a long time.
She was.
Well, and if you can imagine having that kind of coordination at that young age, because those stitches are tiny.
Yes.
They're very small stitches, and I think that we're hard pressed to teach kids today how to have that kind of fine motor skills so young.
Or the patience to do something for so long.
Yeah.
Do we know why the quilt pieces were not put into a quilt?
We don't know why it's just the top. It looks as if it was one piece that was cut into 2 pieces. But do you have any insight on that, Ginny? Yeah,
no, like many quilts or pieces of quilts, you lose the actual story. And this brings up a really interesting point. When pieces come into the museum, often they come with a family oral history. And as quilt history has developed over the last few decades, we're finding that the oral history may or may not be correct. And it's really critical that as pieces are donated to the museum, that proper documentation come with it if possible. And if not, the registrar sometimes has to be very gentle in explaining that it may not be what they think. And I've had experience when people bring in a quilt saying, this is made out of my grandmother's house dresses, and as you begin to examine the quilt, you'll find 90 different fabrics in it. And it's probably doubtful that the grandmother had 90 different house dresses. And so very gently you explain to them that it probably was a kit quilt that was ordered, and their grandmother very likely made the quilt. And that's a family treasure. But you have to be very diplomatic as you explain that the story may have changed through the years. And so I always like to tell people that it's important to sign and date your quilts and leave as much explanation behind as you can with that piece, so that as it's passed from generation to generation, that accurate information is found with it.
Well, and I would add to that we work really hard on our family history and writing down our personal histories and our stories, but these family heirlooms that you have are a part of that. And if you don't document the story right now as you know it, maybe Mom remembers what her mom told you, but when you get down to your grandkids, it's going to be a different story. But if you write it down now, even if you're not donating it to the museum, it's a family treasure, and you should keep those stories with it.
One of the things that I think is important, and that I have seen a great change in church historic sites, and I would compliment the church historical department, is that things like quilts and other things have become historical artifacts rather than beautiful accessories. And we want to make sure that they're artifacts and not just pretty things to put out. And it's very important partly because the public in general has become so educated themselves. And I have been with people as they've come through church historic sites or through other historic sites outside the church, and they can say, that isn't what it says. And so when it's a reproduction, it needs to be represented as a reproduction and not just something that is stated to be something from the 1800s when someone reproduced it. And the church has an obligation to be correct in whatever it shows. The church is doing a wonderful job of that.
Angela, did you have something to say? You wanted to say?
Oh, I was just going to say that, often we focus so much on journal writing and keeping a record because that's our Western tradition, a written record of our stories and our past and our lineage. But we forget that oftentimes our memories and our emotions and our thoughts are more intimately connected to objects. And so oftentimes those memories are more easily shared and passed on and preserved for future generations through objects. Right. And those preserving the record of those stories along with the object is extremely important.
And that's really what we were able to draw on to create this exhibit and make it the meaningful display that it is.
Several of the quilts have very specific family history references. The empty nest quilt, for example, represents a stage of life in that particular in the Haglund family. When their children had all left that year, their youngest daughter had graduated from high school, and they have a block for each of their children and for themselves, representing the stage of life they're in. And I'm trying to think of the other quilts. Martha Mancha's piece, Metamorphosis, was done to, when she first was making it, she wasn't sure who she was going to give it to. But as she made it, she kept thinking of her grandmother and her mother who taught her to sew. And her daughter kept saying, "Can it please be mine? Can it please be mine?" And as she gave it to her, she said, "This is for you, for your aunts, for your mother, from me, for your grandmother." And so it became a very emotional connection as she gave it to her daughter. And I think that's one of the pleasing things about the exhibit, is the ties that it represents to generations. And I think that's what we were trying to represent in the exhibit.
Well, and the beauty, I think, of all of these quilts is that because of all the symbolism that can be incorporated into them, they're really layered with a variety and multiple stories about different individuals and different elements of the same individual's life. And so just in having one object is like an illustration for an entire book of stories about one person.
So the various layers you talk about, let's talk about the Hmong quilts. There's you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Our listeners aren't quite as sure. There is one large story cloth,
right,
and then one smaller flower cloth.
Right.
The large one basically shows daily tasks of a given family or a given person. Somebody try to describe a little better what that
well,
is.
the Hmong people, the flower cloth is actually their traditional textile art, and it's very symbolic. And the shapes and symbols that they use in creating the flower cloth represents different things for their culture. And unlike traditional quilts, this is kind of they're not traditional quilts. It's a textile art, but we thought it was close enough to include them in this exhibit. And then what happened was, over time, they became a people on the run, really. They suffered a lot of political problems and ended up being a culture of refugees. And as they went, the most recent being the Vietnam War, which displaced their people again. And as they went through those changes, they had a verbal history of their people, but not a written documentation. And so that's where the story cloth developed, was as they were moving around, they began to embroider into the cloth their traditions and their stories and their history so that they wouldn't lose it. And those actually also became pieces that others were interested in and they could sell to have means to provide for their families. So the flower cloth is the very traditional textile art, and the story cloth is a little bit more recent that came about because of their moving around and is a documentation of their traditional way of life.
What's interesting about that, I think, is that what that piece of cloth becomes in essence is a record of a woman's identity. And like I said before, multiple layers of her identity, because she is preserving the culture and the memory of her past to pass on to others. But in essence, what she's doing is saying, I am a refugee, so separated in this world from any sense of belonging somewhere. And this is how I'm identifying myself. This is who I am. And so it really becomes a very personal expression of seeking and searching for a sense of self and a sense of relationship to a community, but also a broader expression of who those people are collectively. And so it's just there's so much richness and depth to the content included in that piece.
Unlike some art, quilts are utilitarian. You can look at them for the beauty and you can stay warm. The flower cloth, is it art only, or is it used for other things?
They're generally made as an artistic expression and an aesthetic for the home, not usually, and at least to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, they are artistic.
So we talked about the story cloth, and it depicts not the great things that some hero of the country is doing. Let me just go down a short list here of some of the things. Go to farm, grind grain, feed the hens, throw the ball, kill the pig, do the harvest. These are everyday items that everybody has to do, and it's just kind of very much a story.
Yeah, they document that daily task, and there's also some about ceremony in there. One of my favorite little images depicted is a man with a chicken in his hand, and there's a woman standing next to him, and underneath it says, to wave a live chicken over the head of a woman to make her his wife, or something like that. Anyway, I just think it's cute.
Well, and I think that in that little section of the exhibit, it's all about our relationship with ourselves and identifying who we are as individuals. And it's really interesting that so many pieces we have found that belong in that category are about everyday, ordinary life situations. We have the Hannah Lawrence. What is she doing? She is learning how to sew as a child. It's just an everyday thing. That's what she does every day. And a piece that's actually a painting that looks like a quilt by Pam Bowman talks specifically about our daily rituals, the simple things we do every day that just become who we are because they're what we do every single day. And it's really interesting that we not only identify ourselves that way, but inadvertently, in many ways, keep a record of that.
Right. And
I think one of the things that is fascinating to me as a quilt historian about quilt makers themselves is the broad variety of people you find in the group. I did a project once on the Utah Quilt Guild that included a study of the range of ages, the range of education, and you find that it is so inclusive. In a quilt group that I've quilted with for over 30 years, we had an age range. This was a group of about 25 women, and the ages spanned 45 years. We had high school graduates to PhDs. We had women who were married to professionals and women who were widows. And that's represented in this quilt exhibit, too. You have people who come from very different backgrounds. And so the quilt making process itself spans all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds, and it's a very inclusive way to be part of a larger group that isn't found in a lot of other groups or artistic expressions. It's very inclusive, and I really like that.
We're talking today about Pieces of Me, Quilted Expressions of Human Ties, a beautiful exhibit at the Church Museum of Art. Our guests are Angela Ames, Jennifer Hadley, and Jeannie Fetzer. Near the Hmong quilts, the Hmong pieces, I should say, is one called Remember the Lilies of the Field by Donna Moyer. And I've been a big fan of Escher my whole life. And this quilt is so Escher-esque, if that's a word. Tell me a little bit more about how this quilt came to be.
Yeah, you're right. It is just one giant tessellation. And it's that particular quilt is interesting. Donna Moyer is a volunteer at the museum. And during the time she created that quilt, her husband was very ill. And we saw her go through this process of coping with her husband's illness. And that quilt was a project she began to help her through that process. And it's a very touching, powerful representation of how that experience changed her relationship with the Savior and her testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the lilies in that quilt have come to symbolize to her the hand of the Lord in our lives and his comfort and his presence and the peace that he will bring through times of hardship and times of trial. And she talks about how through every bit of the process of creating that quilt, she came to know more and more about how the Lord was present during that rough, difficult time.
And the amazing part, at least to me, about the art of quilting is you can do anything. You're not limited in any way. And she on this piece her quilt that she called "Remember the Lilies of the Field," she actually has some scripture quoted there. Around the other side is another quilt that has every article of faith inscribed on it. Tell me a little bit more about technique and what people use and do.
That's the Schimmelbusch family quilt is what you're referring to, and they wanted to create a quilt that would be a representation of their faith and their family. And so they decided to use a Baltimore album quilt style.
And what is that?
That is an applique style that was developed in the 1840s, and it's a very time-consuming, difficult,
but beautiful.
And it involves appliquing flowers and wreaths onto a block of muslin, and then underneath those blocks they have stamped, I think it may have been actually done by computer, but I'm not sure.
Jamie Davis is the one that created the quilt. She did the technique where Krista Schimmelbusch and her husband helped to design. And it was Jamie drew everything by hand, and then I think she used a transfer.
She used a photo transfer?
I believe so, yeah.
To have the articles of faith underneath this beautiful applique. And it is one of the most beautiful quilt techniques done. And then it's quilted very closely together throughout the quilt. Mm-hmm. It is what I would call a masterpiece quilt. And
so each block has a traditional symbol, a traditional pattern from a Baltimore album quilt, and then they've tied it together with their family history and with the church. So each block has an article of faith under it as well. So, for example, the article of faith that speaks of the gathering of Israel, on that block they used a traditional image of a ship only they changed the flags on those ships to be from the countries that their family migrated from. So it incorporates all, it's that layering Angela was talking about. It incorporates their heritage of faith in this gospel. It incorporates their family history, and it incorporates the heritage of quilting with the style that they chose to use.
I saw a wedding dress in a nice big glass case. Why was that included in this exhibit?
The wedding dress, this goes along with the Bullock quilt. And this is Jeannie's favorite.
It's my favorite
so
quilt
I'll
in
let
the
her
whole
tell
collection.
you about it.
Tell us about that one.
Do you know that quilt has been in the collection a long time, but has never been exhibited? And the visual impact of that quilt, which we're not really sure when it was made, which is why it has a circa date, which gives you leeway on both sides. When it was first brought into the collection, it was stated that it was made during the winter of 1848. But they were not married until 1852. Mm-hmm. And the original family record says that they made it together. And so we changed the date to circa 1852 to give us a little leeway. We also learned the fabrics that are in it are a little bit early for 1852, but possible. We also learned that Paul Bullock, the husband, traveled, so he may not have brought the fabric across the plains. Perhaps he brought it back from one of his travels and gave it to his wife to make. It would have taken a lot of effort for the two of them to have completed it in one winter. So this is a good example of the oral history may be a little bit different than the actual facts. But I like plain quilts. And though this is not particularly plain, it's not the most beautiful quilt in the collection. But I love the fact that they worked on it together. Mm-hmm. And then when Jennifer found the wedding dress to go with it, we were just so excited to have them pieced together. And the other thing that's interesting, it's not a white wedding dress, which we in this generation think of as being what we think of as a wedding dress. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful, beautifully made dress, and to pair them together seemed just right.
Yep. And we also have on the main floor in the museum, in our historic gallery, we have the journal that he kept while he was it was the Vanguard Company.
Thomas Bullock, when the original Vanguard Company, led by Brigham Young, came to Utah, Thomas Bullock was acting as a clerk, and he kept a journal with a record of all the details they needed to know to be able to help those who were following find their way. And so just coincidentally, we've discovered that this man who was so instrumental in helping the saints gather in Utah was also a quilter, and he was pulling his brand new family together one stitch at a time with his wife when they got to the valley and had to start building a settlement.
So, and I misstated his name. I said Paul. And
yeah,
that
I
was
think
who,
it's Thomas
that's who,
Paul.
Yes,
it?
and
Thomas.
Paul was involved in donating it later, I think.
Oh, is that what it was?
Anyway, so you may need to correct that. But
let's talk about crazy quilts for a minute.
Crazy quilts are great. Crazy quilts are kind of our title piece for the show, is a crazy quilt. And the reason we chose that as kind of symbolic of our exhibit is because a crazy quilt incorporates a lot of different types of fabrics, different colors. They're usually very lush fabrics, velvets and silks and things of that nature. And you take scraps in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and you piece them together into a block, and then piece the blocks together. So as opposed to a traditional pieced quilt where you see a definite repeating pattern in the shapes that you put together, a crazy quilt is crazy, and there is no pattern in those pieces. And so we really liked that symbolism and how our lives are like that. You know, we have all of these little bits and pieces that come together to make us who we are, but if you look at them separately, they don't necessarily look like it's not a nice, repetitive, organized pattern. Our lives are crazy. So that's why we chose the crazy quilt. Would you add anything, either of you?
Just looking at this, the Frances Ellen Reese quilt, there's just so many symbols and pictures that she included, which must tell us about her. I noticed a Scottish thistle, a lucky horseshoe, an American flag, a water bear, meaning, I don't know, maybe she was born under Aquarius or something, a dove of peace, she and her husband's initials, and a representation of the fable, the heron and the fox. So it's hard to know exactly why she put these in there, but it tells us.
It was very common to include those kinds of things as they completed a crazy quilt. You would sometimes find political ribbons from the time. You would find things, even millinery flowers from their hats appliqued onto a crazy quilt. Mm-hmm. So it was very common to include
little verses and scriptures embroidered in. Yeah.
It was very common at the end of the 19th century to do a crazy quilt.
Very fun, actually. So
yeah.
There's another called a variation on a crazy quilt that, to me, it was a great example of bringing people together. They were each given a basic design to follow with their piece, with a circle in the center, with a quarter circle on each corner, which, when you bring them all together, creates a bunch of circles. So it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's the Hattie Nye quilt, and it was created. She was wife of a mission president. She was actually the first sister missionary to receive a certificate saying, calling her to be a sister missionary. She wasn't the first sister missionary, but the first to receive a certificate. And that quilt was created as an expression for their love. When the Nyes were released, all the sisters came together to create that quilt to let them know how much they loved and appreciated them.
You talked about how they were each given a design, and then they pieced their scraps together. And it's really interesting to look at crazy quilts and all the representations of different crazy quilts I've seen, because they look like they're not structured and there's no pattern. It's just a bunch of random pieces thrown together. But most of them are designed based on a basic square. And stitched together into squares of scraps, and then those squares are all pieced together. And that really contributes a lot to this concept that we built the exhibit on, because we do have basic foundational relationships in our lives that all of our lives are composed of. All of these seemingly small relationships with others that compose our identities.
So we talked about our relationship with ourself being one of those foundations, our relationship with our family, with our communities, with the world. And there's not a section in the exhibit that specifically talks about our relationship with God. And the reason we did that is because we really felt that relationship permeates all others, and that it can be found throughout our lives and shapes our other relationships. And so even though there's not a specific section in the exhibit about our relationship with God, in every section you can find pieces that represent that relationship. Like we talked about the Donna Moyer piece in the first section of Self. She had a lot of self-discovery with that piece, but it also, her relationship with the Lord changed and evolved with it as well.
Another significant quilt I noticed was the To All Worthy Male Members. I was about 2 days away from the mission field when that revelation came, so it became a significant part of my missionary service. But this quilt shows 24 traced hands of priesthood holders worldwide.
And they're specific people that she traced.
Yes, specific, actual people, and representing the event of the revelation of all worthy male members receiving the priesthood. A very moving piece, actually. So.
The story behind that quilt is actually one of my personal favorites, and we have it on exhibit paired with a radio that belonged to Joseph William Billy Johnson, and he was one of the first members of the church in West Africa. He was very instrumental in bringing the church to that region of the world, and he relates a powerful story about waiting and waiting and waiting for years. I think it was more than 10 years waiting to receive the priesthood, and to be able to have the church made official in Africa. And this radio happened to be the instrument through which he received word of the revelation. And he said he was just turning on the radio to listen. He had been praying and praying, and had come home very discouraged because he was teaching all of these doctrines to people and hoping for so long to receive these truths officially, and had come home really discouraged that night. And he knelt down to pray and then turned on the BBC and said he was fiddling with the knob, and all of a sudden heard the voice of the prophet. And so that's a really fun artifact to have there, paired with that quilt, to kind of round out and complete the story on a very personal level of one individual.
And next to that radio, we also have the ordination book, the record that was kept, and you can see when he received the priesthood. And just a couple lines later, he was ordaining others to the priesthood. So it's a very powerful piece.
Having been a member of the audiovisual department of the church, now the media services department, that event of him listening to the radio was depicted very beautifully in a movie called Lives of Service.
Yes,
it was.
And I've just loved that story for so many years.
Well, and I think it's a very powerful story for a lot of people. I know that, there are so many pioneers all over the world, but many people know his name and that story. And I think it's become there because there is something so very real and tangible that we can connect that story to. Yeah. And we all come to this realization that there are a lot of ways that we receive revelations in our lives. And they may not always be powerful miracles. Sometimes it's just an ordinary object and an ordinary means through which we receive those little tidbits of information and tender mercies from the Lord.
And I really like the way that powerful story is connected to us through that quilt. Emma Alabez made the quilt, and she was from California, and yet she had such a powerful connection and relationship to that concept and that story, not necessarily specifically his story, but, to depict that quilt and celebration with our brothers around the world.
Thank you. We're talking today with Jeannie Fetzer, Jennifer Hadley, and Angela Ames about Pieces of Me, Quilted Expressions of Human Ties, an exhibit at the Church Museum of Art. Let's talk just a little bit more about some of the specific quilts that are over there. There's one that is called Pink and Blue Squares. Tell me about the history of that one.
That's another great example of a piece that needs to be investigated a little bit further. It's interesting that the date on that quilt in the museum record is 1935. It was used as a fundraiser for the 8th Ward in Salt Lake City during the Depression. And I had a phone call from one of the family members who happens to be a Fetzer, which is my last name, as she noticed that her parents were listed on that quilt, but their marriage took place in 1941. Mm-hmm. And so I promised her that we would look at the museum record and see. So she said, well, what do you think happened? And I said, well, it's possible that the quilt was auctioned and not quite finished. And with the embroidery of all those names, it would take time to finish. And by the time it was finished, your parents were married. So we're going to do a little digging after the exhibit comes down and see if we can pinpoint a little more accurately when it was finished. But it has members of the ward from the Salt Lake 8th Ward. And here's what you would do to research it. We would need to take the names and then go over to the Church History Library and look in the minutes of the 8th Ward and find out who. You can find out by looking at who was saying prayers. You can find out who was in the Sunday school classes. I've done some of that research before to find out information in my history research. And that's what I would do as a quilt historian, to see if I can find possibly when that quilt was finished. As a quilt maker, I've taken as long as 10 or 15 years to finish a particular quilt. So it's not a bad thing to have listed it as 1935, but we'll see if we can find out for that particular family when it was actually finished.
And the story was that the ward came together to raise funds because they needed a new building. And that story, just because the date is a little suspect, doesn't necessarily mean that story is suspect.
No, not at all. And that's not what the family's saying.
Document.
But she was just curious because, it lists her mother as married, and they weren't married till 1941. And I said, well, we'll find out for you. And that's part of a good job, the job of a good museum, too, is to help families find out.
This is another one of those quilts that people are curious about because it doesn't stand out as being a showpiece. It does not stand out as something that most museums would hang.
It's probably the most unattractive quilt we have in the exhibit.
It's not even very pink and blue, for that matter.
No. It's pretty faded. Yeah.
But it has thrilled this family. This whole family has brought down nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and they're so excited. And they part of it is covered up by a case that displays other things. And she said, when the exhibit comes down, can we please come take a picture with our family in front of the quilt? And I said, of course you can. Yeah.
But the essence behind that quilt really is that this is a group of people who needed a place to worship, and they pulled together to find the funds, and they did it through quilting. And a variety of different people in this community of a congregation, and they all pitched in together to help create it.
Something that's been going through my mind during this time is the act of history, or being a historian, doesn't change depending on whether it's a book or a document or a quilt. It's all very similar in the way you go about proving things.
Yep.
Another couple of pieces, Angel's Portion, Seeking Virtue. Who can tell me about that one? Maybe
I can tell you a little bit about it. Jody Warner, the quilter, has in that piece depicted 7 women, and they represent to her the virtues that women in her life and in the world around her display, and the wonderful, amazing qualities that they have and what they contribute to the community around them every single day. And so she has several different women depicted there. One is a scholar, one is a mother, one is a home builder, and she's used a lot of symbols in that quilt to depict different elements of their personalities and the way that they contribute to the world around them.
There is one piece in every section that has an additional audio loop to it, and this is one quilt that I would really recommend listening to that, because Jody goes through and talks about all the different symbols on each woman and why she placed them there. And in addition to the individual audio pieces on the kiosk, all of the quilts are on there. So if you wanted to hear Donna Moyer talk about her quilt, just look at the kiosk and you can hear her talk about it. But that's definitely Angel's Portion and the Schimmelbusch quilt that we talked about before are 2 that I would definitely listen to, because there's so much symbolism worked in that they talk about.
Jody is an example of someone who has taken her talent and developed it and shared it literally with the world. Her patterns and her lectures are known throughout the quilt world, and she is an excellent quilt artist. And in addition to using it as a profession, she donates a lot of time to schools and other places where she shares her story quilts. And she is a wonderful, wonderful artist, very talented, very gifted, and does unique things with her talent.
Well, and this is a quilt that's a really, really great example of one that tells a story, multiple stories. This story in general of women that Jody has chosen to depict, but also her own story about quilting in her life and how it has connected her to people. But it is also a showpiece. It has received awards regionally and nationally, and it's one that we are very privileged to have to show in the museum.
Wow.
One you wouldn't see on a bed.
No.
Well, you all keep bringing up the fact that quilting is basically sharing a story, and evidently there's an opportunity for attendees or even anyone to share their story through quilting. How is that to be done?
We have a couple of kiosks in the gallery, and the one I mentioned previously where you can go and it's a touch screen, so you can just touch on whatever image you want and hear the stories. And there's more on the kiosk than what is in the gallery. And then there's another little station. It's kind of like a little old photo booth where you can just go inside this little space, and there's a webcam there and a touch screen that walks you through so that you can share your quilt story with us. And it will allow you to record a short little clip and tell us about your quilt. And then we will eventually get those on to the kiosk in the gallery, as well as soon as we get our website up, they'll be on the website so that everybody can share together and hear other people's stories and be enriched by others.
I think one of the nice things you can do in the kiosk while your children might be playing in the interactive area is listen to the stories of the humanitarian efforts of the church through quilts. And it was my experience while I worked on the quilts for the Iowa floods, as I thought about the people that they would go to, that for now, that might be the most beautiful piece of bedding they owned. And it was a simple act for me to give a little time to help tie some quilts or to bind a quilt. And yet, for someone in need, it could be a real treasure. And it's a way that we can help contribute worldwide, literally, as we give a little bit of our time.
In that context, it seems like quilting is basically for warmth, but it can represent so much more.
Emotional and physical warmth.
Exactly.
An expression of love and concern and care. Yeah.
There's a wonderful story of a quilt shop owner here in Salt Lake who chooses a new humanitarian project every year, who has literally donated thousands of quilts over the last few years to different humanitarian projects. And how she does it is she posts in her shop what she's doing, and her customers just come in, and she donates the fabric, and just her customers come in and take the fabric that she donates and brings back the quilts, and then she has donated them to cancer victims, to Indian tribes. Each year she chooses a different project, and it's just a wonderful way for people to give of their time and give to people they don't know, and I just think it's a great thing.
And hers are really great because they're all local communities.
I would be remiss as a grandson if I didn't mention my grandmother, Nyona Knutson, when I was sitting in her funeral down in Arizona. One of my uncles got up and mentioned her quilt making and asked everyone in the audience who had received a quilt from her to stand up. It was everybody. She made so many quilts, and
That's
like
wonderful.
you say, it's a personal deal, and she just did it for everyone.
Yeah.
See, and this is a perfect example about how everyone has a story to tell about a quilt in their life.
Yes, you should come over and put that in our kiosk.
Yeah. See, the thing that I love about the kiosk, and I really hope that even though our website is delayed right now, people will submit their stories and share them with us, or come into the gallery and share them with us, because this is our way of, through quilting, connecting with and developing relationships with our audiences and with our visitors. And our way of expressing to you and to them that you are a part of us. All of our visitors are the little pieces that make up our museum and that make up who we are as a museum. And all of the stories that there are to tell out there that relate to the content of the history of the church belong to you, but are also a part of our story. And they need to be told, and they need to be shared, and they need to be connected to and related to everything that we're sharing as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've been discussing the Church Museum of Art exhibit, Pieces of Me, Quilted Expressions of Human Ties with Jennifer Hadley, Angela Ames, and Jeannie Fetzer. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Nathan Wright, and you're listening to the Mormon Channel of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.